Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Gael Muggle land. I'm Liam Miller, he, him, his, and Love, Rinse, Repeat is part of the Uniting Mission and Education arm of the Uniting Church Synod of New South Wales, ACT, and I'm excited to be a part of that family. My guest today is the wonderful Joshua Ralston. Joshua, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat.
Thank you so much for having me. I only wish I could be in Australia with you, but it'll be fun to connect across the globe.
Indeed, yeah, I'm very excited for this. Yes, we were just talking off camera that you were all slated to come out to Australia a bit over a year ago now, and talking about some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today. And so, this is certainly a pale comparison, but it's certainly nice to be able to do it.
Yeah, it's great.
For those who don't know, Joshua Ralston is a reader in Christian-Muslim relations at the School of Divinity, University of Edinburgh, and director and co-founder of the Christian-Muslim Studies Network funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. He has published widely on Reformed Theology, Christian theological engagements with Islam, Arab Christianity, and on political theology. His monograph, Law and the Rule of God, A Christian Engagement with Shari'a, was published by Cambridge University Press 2020, and that is our topic today. So I guess before we maybe get specifically into the book, something I've been interested in exploring a bit with some of the guests recently is, I don't think it's anyone just naturally falls into being a theologian, especially even, an academic theologian or what have you. So I'm just curious about how you led into this world, what first got you interested in exploring this, and perhaps then what drew you kind of into the more specific area that you're working today.
Yeah, thanks. Our own stories are often a little bit of a mystery to ourselves. But I think there's a few key points in my life that I can look back on that sort of led me to engage as a theologian in general, and then as a theologian who tries to think with Islam more specifically. I mean, as a child, I grew up in a pretty evangelical, charismatic world in Southern California, where I'm from, even though I'm based in Scotland now. But I always asked a lot of questions. Both my parents were school teachers, and that kind of idea was encouraged. And so there was always a sense of don't ask so many questions, trust the Spirit, read the Bible. But I would read the Bible and it would ask me more questions. So I went off to university and I studied philosophy. And in part, that allowed me to ask these big questions. How do we know what is true? Is there a God? If so, what is God like? But at the same time, some of the ways that philosophy was rendered, especially history of philosophy or analytics, seemed disconnected from lived reality. And that sort of pushed me a little bit towards theology. One really powerful experience was the university that I went to in the States, Wake Forest, was starting a divinity school when I was an undergraduate. And one of the theologians came a little bit early and had to teach some undergrads a class on the providence of God. And so we read a process theologian, a hardline Calvinist, Langdon Gilkey, Pannenberg, Barth. But Columbine happened about 3 weeks before our final exam. And instead of doing a final exam, he made us choose 2 of the 5 theologians we studied and write how would these theologians make sense of Columbine, which I think really made that question real, right? So if someone who is coming from more conservative background at the time, can I really say these things about God in the hardline Calvinist way in light of these events? Can I really say that? And that sort of opened me up a little bit more to some of these questions. There's a lot of other stories along the way. I worked at a church for a number of years in the Presbyterian Church USA in university ministry, but eventually thought, I'm more suited for academic life. And so pursued a master's and then a PhD in Christian theology. When it comes to Islam more specifically, I've told this story a little bit elsewhere. While I was doing my MDiv and PhD, my wife and I, as well as a seminary colleague of mine, Gadam Poyo, started a church and a ministry with people who had been resettled as refugees, part of the Peace USA's new church development in Atlanta, Georgia. And alongside that, I met a lot of Muslims who had been resettled from Somalia, from Iraq, from Sudan, and became particularly close to 3 boys, Ibrahim, Amr, and Tamer. And they just started asking me questions after we became friends. Why does Jesus have to die for God to be merciful? Isn't God just naturally merciful? How can God be three in one? Why do you do this on Easter? And here I was, a PhD student in theology, taking courses on Schleiermacher, on Thomas Aquinas, on Heidegger, and the questions of like a 17 and 19-year-old boy sort of hit to the heart of my faith. And I thought, if I can do this, what if I start studying the Islamic tradition in serious ways? And one thing led to another. My wife at the time worked in international development, so we ended up in Egypt and then in Ramallah in Palestine for about 2.5 years, and that sort of solidified that interest. So that's a long answer to a short question, but some of the things that led me to this.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things that I might come back to that emerges there, you write in the acknowledgements about, like Barth talks about writing theology as if nothing is happening, but how could you do so as you're writing this book, and so many of the events that touch upon it, even if not explicitly mentioned, something was definitely happening. And I guess, hearing you talk about the story with Columbine, it's that kind of theology in response, or at least aware of what's going on around. So we might come back to that. So then this book, I know, is a significantly revised version of your PhD. So maybe just talk to us a little bit about the broad sweep of the book, maybe a bit of its genesis, like this particular focus, and I guess key hopes for it as it's now flying out in the world.
Yeah, I think obviously the very concept of Shari'a is in the news. It's debated. People have opinions about it, well-founded or not. And so I was very aware of some of those debates. And I was also, during my PhD, taking a directed study course on modern Islamic thought. And I realized that a lot of the ways that various Muslim intellectuals were struggling with questions of justice, modernity, the state, resonated with what a lot of things I already knew in 20th and 21st century Christian theology, be that liberation thought, whether that's sort of the dialectic turn. And I thought, this is a conversation that needs to be happening. And so the book was an attempt to try to think through those things. I didn't necessarily want it to only be about law. I thought, let's talk about justice, the state more broadly. But one of my committee members was just like, you're chickening out. Like, the thing is the law. So why don't you narrow that down? And so that was some of the reasons that I went there. I was aware that it raises a lot of issues, especially in public discourse. But there was a sense that I was frustrated that a lot of the ways that political liberals, liberationists, Christian theologians from a wide variety of camps were talking about Islamic legal thought. And I thought it was, there was a sense that if you read it primarily, yes, there are some renderings of it that I would consider deeply problematic, but there was other ways that it was a source and inspiration for anti-colonial work or transnational solidarity. And I wanted to try to engage with some of those ideas. And at the same time, in doing that, I started reading Islamic thought that was being critical of Christian theology, of raising really important questions about how do Christians understand the nature of God's law and God's justice in relation to Jesus. And I wanted to sort of tease some of those out. So that was the inspiration behind it and what I was trying to get at. It's essentially to say, is there a way we can engage with Islamic thought about the law in a way that is nuanced, charitable, but also allows for space of critique from both directions?
Yeah, thank you for that. Something you write early on in the book is, yes, there's a danger in considering Islam as reduced to Sharia, but at the same time, it is impossible to engage Islam without Sharia. To reject Sharia taught as inherently theocratic or barbaric, or as a works-based view of salvation that is incompatible with either Christian or liberal values, is to fail to engage honest Christian-Muslim exchange, to collapse back into a dominant secular paradigm, and to evade one of the central political theological debates of the past century. So as you kind of hinted at, it's definitely a word we've all heard. But I think for most of the audience, or at least a decent patch of people who are listening today, it's kind of that thing it's just invoked as a thing that is going to be imposed upon us unless we take radical steps to ensure that our liberal democratic law is uncontested and consolidated. So maybe just, I even think it might be what, it's probably a very complex question, but what does the word mean? What is it actually referring to? Just as a starting point, like, outside of some of, the usual kind of polemical evocation of it.
Yeah, so the term Shari'a is an Arabic word that comes from the root of Shari'a, which means the way. So you can think of it as sort of a way of life, a way of being. Sometimes Muslims will translate it as the way to the watering hole or the way to God. And so it has this broader connotation. I co-teach a class with my Muslim colleague Mona Siddiqui on Islamic law, and we call it From Prayer to Politics. And it really is that. It's everything from how you pray, when you pray, how you fast, how you're married and divorced, if you should take interest, why you shouldn't. So it does cover a wide scope of things. I think another thing that's really interesting is that the term Sharia classically isn't restricted to Islam. And in fact, in the Arabic medieval period, they would quite often talk about a Christian Sharia or a Sharia al-Injil or a Sharia al-Torah, a Sharia of the Torah or a Sharia of the Gospels. And so it's simply a broader religious way of life. So if you know much about Judaism, it's often much closer to something like halakha than canon law, because it does cover everything from dietary laws to marriage to criminal punishment. So I think that's sort of the broader concept, but like anything in a religious tradition, it's been long debated, because the Quran and the Hadith, the examples of the Prophet, don't answer all the questions that Muslims have about life. And so different schools of law have developed about how to answer and how to engage with these kind of questions. So that's a little bit about it. Obviously, when it comes to the things you were talking about earlier, theocratic-wise, in the 20th century especially, it's become identified with certain acts of sort of criminal punishment and theocratic rule, especially as exemplified in sort of post-1979 Iran or Saudi Arabia.
So one of the things you also talk about early on is there's this real gap in political theology, in actually engaging this kind of conversation about law and about how we live, which, as you say, this debate's been happening within Islam, and they're asking questions of other models. So it's this ripe field, but it's kind of entirely or not entirely, but predominantly ignored. And you kind of talk about, if it is engaged, it's mostly at this kind of superficial level of political violence or fanaticism. So I guess maybe one question was about why the gap? Like, is there any kind of, is it just a bias against the school? Is it it's too hard to, we haven't looked at it before and now it's too well developed, too hard to get into it? And I guess then talking about your work of kind of trying to move, I guess, push political theology toward comparative theology and trying to in order to address this gap. So yeah, just curious a bit about the any kind of thoughts about the reason this gap has kind of developed and then expanded, and then how you're thinking of approaching it.
Yeah, I think when you talk about the field of political theology, it itself has largely operated with the Christian or post-secular binary. So either the school of thought that follows people like Carl Schmitt, all political concept or secularized theological concepts, the notion of the exception and the sovereign, this kind of trajectory. Or you've got the new political theologians, Metz, Moltmann, etc. So you have this sort of split between these two, the more genealogical side and then the more Christian normative side, which may end up in your Oliver O'Donovans or whoever. And Islamic thought hasn't been engaged with it that often, even though there's been this complex debate within Islamic studies and anthropology about the nature of the secular in Islam. And so I think there's a way in which those fields of discourse could engage with one another, and I try to propose that they should, and especially those political theologians who view themselves as Christians, that there's a particular reason to engage. Why is this the case? I think there's a number of reasons. One has to do with the politics of translation. Neither Arabic nor Persian nor Turkish are particularly well-known languages amongst Western scholars, especially Arabic, as the language that I use in my texts. And so what gets translated, to be completely honest, tends to be either so-called radical Islam or liberal progressive Islam. So a lot of times the wide diversity of thinkers that are debating ideas of the secular, of post-secularity, of justice within the Islamic tradition are not engaged. But even there are a number that are. And there's a sense that it's just off limits. I think there's an emerging interest in it. I'm on the editorial board of the journal Political Theology, and we've done a lot more at trying to expand that conversation. But it remains the case that at least Christian theologians more specifically have yet to sufficiently engage with Islam. And when they do, it's usually sort of post 9/11 tropes. Islam as Deen wa Dawla, religion in the state, Shari'a as a bugaboo. And I think a lot of this has to do with the realities of sort of post 1979 Iran, and then again Al-Qaeda, those two, and then later ISIS, right? Those become what it means to talk about Islam in politics, not Rashid Ghannouchi, an Islamist in Tunisia who ends up in a democratically elected situation after the Arab Spring, doesn't use the word Sharia in his constitution. So there's a wide variety of these thinkers. I think there's an increasing interest in it, but like anything, Islam has been rendered out of Western Christian theology, even when it's been present.
How much does both in terms of that omission and in the way it's often engaged, kind of falls within the broader kind of anti-law, antinomianism of particularly Protestant theology? Like you referenced early on, like when Martin Luther's kind of talking about it, he's comparing the legalism of Islam to that of Rome, or others might compare it to, again, like more kind of negative portrayals of Judaism as well. So like I'm curious about how much of the is also played in, and what you're trying to address is also this kind of, well, law, anytime that word is brought up, it's bad, and Christians really can't engage it because we're now this religion of grace and gospel and yada yada yada.
Yeah, I mean that's where the book tries to end up going, and saying one of the things that we can do when we actually listen to Islamic critiques is look back at ourselves and ask questions. I'm speaking here as a Western Protestant theologian. I'm not speaking for all Christians in all times and places. How have we come to render the law in certain ways? How is that dependent on anti-Judaism in a large portion? How might we make sense of scriptural tradition, history, political justice in new ways in light of this dialogue? But as you say, from Luther, I think actually from Paul onwards, but even especially Augustine and other figures, law gets rendered primarily as something restrictive. It's not, I mean, you can see this. I have a section on Justin Martyr in the book. He even says, the reason God gives the law to Israel isn't because of special election, it's because they are particularly bad. And there's this notion that nothing good could be equated with the law. And you juxtapose this to the way that Rabbinic Judaism talks about law, or Islam talks about law, which is as a gift, as a way of life, as a way that it isn't what saves you, but it is a way to lead you into a whole. Now, that isn't to say that Muslims and Jews don't debate the law, don't recognize its own limits, or have reform movements within themselves. But within the Christian, especially the Latin tradition that I'm part of, there is this tendency to constrict it to convicting us of our sins or unnecessarily restricting us from freedom. And I'm trying to think, is that those parts may be true, but is there more to it than just that?
I think that's really helpful. You kind of talk, I'll go to them in a second. One thing I think also that's interesting is you're talking about just, how much is some of the difficulty in having these conversations, that we're just at fundamentally different starting points when we think about, the necessity of a particular form of nation state. or the actual relation, what is, religion and politics and the relationship between the two, that, Christians coming from the West or the very entrenched in a particular, liberal democratic kind of understanding are just starting at a completely different, fundamentally different point than those working in Islamic scholarship, and having these debates in a completely different context. So I'm just curious a bit about that, like how that makes it potentially a difficult, or I guess also fruitful in the way it pushes against some of the very very deeply assumed assumptions that underlie a lot of how we think of the relationship between religion and politics, if that makes sense. I'm trying to get it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that you could unpack there. One of the things that I'm trying to think about in the book and in my broader work is both to take into consideration some of the real benefits of the legacy of political liberalism on the one hand, but also a lot of the critiques of it from critical theorists, whether this is sort of the Talal Asad, Saba Mahmood school that says, look, secularism isn't neutral. It's an organization of power that decides what counts as religion and what counts as politics. And if you look, I don't know the Australian context as well as I do the American or the European, but the amount of things that are marked throughout in Scotland, England, and Wales, even in France or in Germany, or the United States or Canada, that even if we say they are secular, are undergirded by certain Christian assumptions, even if those have been transposed. Things like when we have a weekend, what holidays we get off. Here in the UK, we still have laws on the books that the prime minister can't be Catholic, which is related to longer, traditions of Catholic. So that, or if you take the case of France, which has this ardent commitment to not just church-state separation, but the state rendering religion interior matter. But the ways in which that happens often assumes sort of Catholic assumptions. And I think one of the things my work is trying to do is say, how can we see this within our own societies? What we take as normal and operative there isn't one secularism, there's a whole host of them. And then what are some of the ways that Muslims, despite our assumptions that they merge religion and politics, what are actually some of the ways in the history of Islamic thought, as well as in Islamic practice, that political leadership and religious courts or theologians actually were separated in more complicated ways than we think, and not to just rush to this assumption that Christianity is the religion that knows how to separate religion and politics, Islam is the one that doesn't, and to say actually religion and politics are constantly interwoven and contested and rethought, and what are some of the different ways that this has happened over time, and what are some ways that we can think afresh about this. So when I engage with the Muslim thinkers throughout the book, I'm looking at a variety of those, some that would argue very much so that Sharia is the answer, and others that are arguing, no, while we still want to hold on to the Sharia, any state that enforces the Sharia is not enforcing God's law, they're enforcing a human law, right? That God's law always remains outside of our grasp. And there's a wide variety of these positions within the Islamic traditions. And I'm trying to say, there's a way to have a conversation that doesn't always end up in the, should Muslims be allowed to have divorce courts, or is Sharia creeping into Australia or the United States because Muslims want to get married under Sharia law? It's one of the things I always say in my class is like, Sharia is already in Australia. Any major bank has an Islamic banking arm, which is under Sharia. Why do they have that? Because they want money, right? And a lot of those Islamic banking actually are getting around the spirit of the Sharia, right? To find a way to get a fee without charging interest, which is really just interest in another name. And there's Muslims who have been critical of this. If there's Muslims getting married in Australia, there's Sharia. If Muslims are praying or practicing Ramadan, there's Sharia. What we're really talking about usually are criminal punishment courts. That's what people are fixated on. And I'm trying to say, we we can talk about that, but there's a much broader conversation that also needs to be going on about some of these issues.
And thank you for that. And I think also, like, as you say, what something that gets brought up is that the way we can become, not see the ways that, you could level a lot of critiques that Christianity isn't this, like, neatly separated off. Like I was thinking, the Australian Parliament still opens with prayer, or, there's every other week, there's probably some debate about somewhere in the US about whether or not they should keep the 10 Commandments outside a courthouse, kind of thing. That, like, it's already kind of very messy. And I guess part of what's good about this conversation is drawing attention to that, and then also helping to resource Christian theologians in thinking through these questions about, how should we respond to such a thing, to such a use of divine law, is in the 10 Commandments, in a, public human law setting, as somehow, enshrining, endorsing, guiding whatever it is that's happening inside this courthouse at the time. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the things political theology, especially the more critical side, is to genealogically uncover that. But once you uncover that, then you have to ask questions. Well, what does that mean for how I engage as a Christian theologian with Islamic thought, Jewish thought, liberal thought, leftist thought, conservative thought, and that there's not this neutral starting point that we all have, but that we need to engage with it. At the same time, I'm critical, both in the book and in my own life, about some of the dangers of invoking divine law to justify political action, and the tendency, especially of that, to be coming from, let's say, more conservative models. But one of the things that the book tries to also push is, just because that's the case doesn't mean we need to give up on this notion of divine law's import for public law. And is there another way to think about this, and to try to draw out some of those dynamics? So not just retreating and saying, oh, because this person invoked, I used an example of, just because Jeff Sessions invokes Romans 13 to justify separating kids from their family at the borders, is that the only way to invoke divine law when we're talking about political action? Are there other ways that actually might press against that use?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's helpful. And so, part of the book is to try to talk about the way in which, I'll try to get the language right here if I can, the way in which, public law is a provisional and indirect witness to the divine rule of justice. Do you want to kind of just expand a little bit on that, as where the book kind of is pushing toward, as I was saying, that, you can still have this connection, but it's not necessarily the one that we're most familiar with?
Yeah, so I mean, in the final chapter, I try to develop, after reading Islamic critiques of Christian theologies of law, looking at some of the ways these emerged. I used some, as I said, I'm a Protestant, used some thinking from especially Wolfhard Pannenberg, Karl Barth, and others to develop this idea of provisional, indirect, and witness. All of those then I play out in particular ways. One of the things I try to do is to situate discussion of the law, as the title of the book says, in the rule of God, or the kingdom of God, and to argue for a number of reasons. One, this is helpful for Christian theology, because oftentimes we look at law in relationship to the gospel, or law in relationship to creation, and I want to put it in a broader framework to say the law is a response to the coming of divine justice. And that this also gives a space to talk about how Muslims debate the law, right? The law is a reflection of God's rule. It isn't God's rule, but is a reflection of God's rule. And that this kind of broader theopolitical space can help our dialogue, rather than just talking about, should Australia have marriage courts for Muslims? Should Iran have freedom of religion for Christians? Those are things we need to address, but not first and foremost. I want to have these broader debates. So that's part of what I'm trying to do in that section, is to situate it in this broader theological account. And then I sort of flesh out all of those terms. What do I mean by witness? In that case, the law isn't justice, but it gestures towards God's justice. And it can do this indirectly, which is related to the word, which it doesn't need to invoke Christianity or Islam in order to do it. That the very act of seeking justice, and here you can see some of the echoes of Barth, or a left-wing reading of Barth, right? It can gesture towards God. It's a parable of the kingdom, even if it doesn't know it. And in fact, a critique of the church is as likely or even more likely to be an indirect witness than the church's own witness. And that we don't actually depend on religious establishment to have a connection to divine justice. And then finally is this phrase provisional, which I play out in the longest section, looking at the crucifixion and resurrection especially. And this is an idea that I was frustrated with two different ways of thinking about it. One from Oliver O'Donovan, who talks about the imperfectibility of the law, which essentially for me ends up in him kind of shrugging his shoulders, like we do our best, but we end up in something like a moderate conservatism. Or Bonhoeffer's notion of the penultimate, which always felt like this sort of, it still had these latent two kingdoms Lutheranism that I didn't care for. And so I use provisionality to try to push in a more leftist direction to say, look, the law does give a witness to God, but it always needs to be, it's always provisional. It's always up for revision. It always needs to be contested and returned to. We never arrive. And so that's a little bit of the more dialectic influences of my thought. I'm not a classic liberal or even a liberationist. I'm against language of we participate in bringing in the kingdom. I much prefer we can bear witness to it in events and protests and things like this. So that's what I'm trying to play out with in that section, and think about how then that can be a framework that I can then engage with Islamic debates themselves. So it's both as an internal way to think about Christian theological engagement and witness, as well as then how can this help me engage with various Muslim debates?
Thank you for that'd be interesting to draw out is you kind of make reference to this about interfaith action and dialogue, usually about a lot of things, but often is about, especially when it comes together toward action, about responding to particular human laws, right? Responding to we need to revise this law, or this law is being used to persecute this religious minority, or and that's kind of the way it's often brought in and focused on, public law and common good, I guess, to summarize that.
Yeah.
But what you're trying to do kind of, I guess, is shift the focus somewhat to both acknowledgement of the ways that law, ethics, public good, and social life are intertwined with divergent theological and scriptural claims. And thus we need to resist the temptation to focus exclusively on questions of public law, state establishment, and human rights, the exclusion of any examination of scripture, personal ethics, soteriology, and theology. So I guess I into the talk a bit about this, and the way that this helps maybe reframe or expand or broaden that kind of, important interfaith work. As you say, there are laws that need to be addressed and changed in various contexts and things like that. But maybe there is this admission that we need to acknowledge that we're coming at it from different ideas, and we think the law, different faith and different faith traditions within different faiths are going to think the law relates to divine justice, as you've said, in different ways. So just interested in talking, for those who are involved in that kind of work, which is good, how this kind of redirection, I guess, in some ways is a helpful corrective.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a little bit complicated because I don't want to push away from those kind of activities. What I do want to question is whether or not those activities can serve to unite us as much as we often think, and to notice that the ways oftentimes some of those activities only already include people who already agree about politics, and that they often serve to exclude certain communities. I'll give a few examples in a minute. And so one of the things I'm critical of is, even though I've said I'm Protestant, I'm very influenced by a lot of Catholic work on Christian-Muslim dialogue. Nostra Aetate in the third paragraph talks about Christians and Muslims having many disagreements and quarrels throughout the year, and instead we should put aside our differences and work towards the common good and human welfare, which is all well and good. But the problem, of course, is that our theological differences actually also touch on our ideas of justice. So things like religious freedom, things like the proclamation of the gospel, understandings of Shari'a, understandings of what counts as good, views about human sexuality, those also involve claims about revelation, interpretation, Shari'a, that we should engage with. And so if what is happening with the call to justice and the common good is an evasion of difference, then I'm trying to criticize it. But at the same time, I do, and I push towards this at the end of the book, want to emphasize those moments of action that aren't just simple, but also might involve transformation. So I use two examples. One from Scotland, where it was Muslim critiques of interest, especially high interest rates, that led the Church of Scotland, a Presbyterian denomination, to rediscover its own critiques of usury and interest rates. And so they've developed a banking system to challenge predatory loans, right? So here's a moment where actually, I mean, Christians aren't going to admit we learned from Sharia, but that's what happened, right? Like, and I think that's important. And then the other is examples around work that I've done on migration in Europe and the ways in which one of the things I think is really important about both Islamic and Jewish thought is that it's primarily interested in the concrete laws, not in the abstract notion of law. And that often Christian theology is more about this nebulous thing called law that we think is settled and fixed. But actually the law is changing, contested, dynamic. And what we're talking about when we talk about laws aren't just the concept of law, but this law, this situation. And it's those that I'm trying to sort of call attention to. And to do that, I think we need to have a little bit more of a reflection on how we understand things. So I'm not against interreligious engagement. I do it. I'm for it. But sometimes, and one example, right, is the whole Israel-Palestine debate is sort of off limits for Jewish, Christian, Muslim dialogue. If you want harmony, don't bring it up. But it is, for Jews, a very important issue about post-Holocaust reality. And for Palestinians, it's a huge issue of injustice and alienation. Right? So here is this thing that for all three parties, because remember, there's lots of Palestinian Christians, is a central reality of justice and of law, leaving aside my own personal politics about, but it's rendered outside the bounds of interreligious engagement. We could talk about similar things where certain more progressive Christians don't want to bring up ideas about the ordination of women or LGBTQ issues because this is perceived to rock the boat. And so insofar as interfaith turns to justice can be a pretty simple, like, let's clean up the neighborhood. Like, cleaning up the neighborhood's great. But is that all there is? And if the only way we can, pick up trash in the neighborhood is if we don't allow ourselves to talk about issues of Israel-Palestine or patriarchy or systemic oppression, well, then that's what I'm trying to press against, to say, can we have this longer conversation that actually may lead to disagreement, but actually can also find other places of solidarity. So that's, I think, a little bit of what I have in my mind. I mean, the irony of me doing interreligious stuff is when I was a seminarian, I thought it was all dumb and a waste of time. And now I'm like, and I still have a little bit of that streak in me, like that if what we're doing is all getting together and saying the most baseline ideas of ourselves and not really engaging with the complexity of our agreements and disagreements, we can do that better at the cafe if we're allowed to ever go again in Scotland.
Yes. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I was curious about, just expanding a little bit on the book. So, you talked about that course you teach with Mona Siddiqui, in Edinburgh. You also talked earlier about teaching in the acknowledgements about teaching in Egypt, and teaching, a bit of comparative theology, a bit of Christian Muslim dialogue and the like. And I was just curious, as I was thinking about reading through the book and knowing a bit about you, those are very different contexts, I feel, to be teaching and engaging in those kind of dialogues, and I'm sure the questions that arise are quite different. And so I guess I got the two questions I have are, one, broadly about the joy and frustration that comes from engaging these kind of dialogues, teaching these kind of courses, and were there any kind of a really clear, like, I mean, obviously there'd be so many, but stark differences, or how it's maybe surprising differences in teaching in those two contexts, or surprising similarities, I should say, as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a real privilege to have taught at, my first job was at a Protestant seminary in the States,
Mhm.
mainline PCUSA seminary and students. I've taught in Egypt, I've taught in Nigeria, I've taught a secular undergraduate course, and then I've got master's and PhD students who could be coming because they want to be a Muslim theologian or a Christian theologian, or because they're sort of a secular scholar of religion. And all of those are really different. Um, and there's certain complications in all of those. You know, there's also the excitement, I think, of doing the kind of work I do, and that Mona and others do. There's a way in which the field of Christian theology, where I was originally trained in, right? Like, the paths are pretty well trodden. It's not that there's not new things to discover. There are. We're talking about the mystery of God in the world. Of course, there's new things to discover, but the questions we ask, the ways we go about answering them, especially in the kind of white male Protestant stuff. Are you a Bardian or a Schleiermachian? Are you a liberationist or a scholastic? They get kind of well trodden, and there's some excitement to saying, here are ways Muslims are thinking about something similar but different. How does this make me rethink my own ideas? How do I teach this? Obviously, teaching to Protestant, I mean, I was teaching at a Protestant seminary in Egypt. As a reminder, there's millions of Christians in Egypt. I'd say to my undergraduates, there's more Christians in Egypt than there are people in Scotland.
Yeah.
The vast majority of them are Coptic, but there's a good 250,000 to 500,000 who are Protestants. And so I was teaching at their seminary at a master's level. So most of them were actually already ministers themselves. And I taught the semester of the Arab Spring, so 10 years ago now. And so that experience was obviously particularly unique and formative, right? Because here's this white, early 30s American coming in to teach Christian Muslim dialogue and the history of Middle Eastern Christianity to people whose lives are marked by this, right? But that's always really informative. And I try really hard in the book to say, I'm not writing to tell Christians in Egypt or Iraq or Nigeria or Muslims in France how to think. I'm trying to think as who I am and in my context. And I've gotten some good feedback from Christians in Indonesia or Egypt. I've gotten some very critical feedback from a really close friend who's a Syrian Christian about that I'm too sympathetic to Shari'a. And I want to take those things on board. But I think part of the joy of teaching in those different contexts is that I have those voices in my head when I'm writing. Like, what does this make sense to a posh English secularist versus a Muslim from Indonesia versus a Syrian Christian? How do I account for those? I'm not responsible only for them. I'm only responsible for myself, but at least having them interrogate my ideas in a way. And that happens most clearly in a classroom. So,
well, thank you for that. That's great. We're coming toward the end. I put out a call for questions on Twitter. Trip Fuller wanted to talk about Schleiermacher, but we'll save that for another day. Because there's going to be an episode with Ruth Jackson Ravenscroft coming up, and as the Twitter Schleiermacher Renaissance, I know you're a part of. You're connected to that movement, so we'll get you on another day to talk about that. And you answered Trip's question about wine, so that's fine. But Matthew Julius, friend of the podcast, hi Matt. He asked a following, which I thought was a good, bringing out what you're saying there, that this is actually, these questions that are live ones for you and your own, theological development and finding your way in the world. He asked the following. So he was asking about, how does comparative theology in dialogue with Islam help deepen or expand your understanding between the relationship of faith and reason, or framed otherwise, feeling and logic? And I guess that came out of a conversation on Twitter where you had spoke about, how Christian claims to triunity or incarnation fumble against the classical Muslim mutakalliman. botched that for sure, and are only persuasive in light of a prior experience of God's saving power through Christ. So this might be way too big a question, so you don't have to go entirely into it in any way. But I guess I was just curious about, you've talked before about, and through this interview, the way those questions you had from those, teenage boys, really were pushing on these live issues, and how, these voices, from the students you've had, challenge how you write and think. So whether you want to take this specific thing that Matt's asking, or whether you want to just kind of talk more broadly about the way you felt it, this comparative theology has personally shaped how you think through some of these really significant questions. I'm turning it over to you to see how you want to play that.
Yeah, so that was I tweet way too much, and I don't like attend to my brand enough on Twitter. I just sort of read something that I find interesting, or say something, or grumble about my work. But I was preparing a class that I'm teaching right now on Jesus and Christian Muslim dialogue, and I was preparing the reading list and reading some of the Muslim critiques of the Incarnation, classical ones, by somebody named Abdul al-Jabbar, as well as Ibn Taymiyyah. These are medieval Muslims, and I just tweeted out that I thought that the Muslim critiques, if you're basing it on logic alone, are more persuasive. And this got retweeted a lot. A lot of Muslims love this. I get lots of Muslims sliding into my DMs asking me when I converted. And I still think that. I think, and Muslims do raise questions to Christians, like, if the fundamental claim of your faith is that God is present for us in Jesus, how do you make sense of the fact that you Christians can't agree on this most fundamental thing? Muslims, of course, are divided about a lot of things. They're divided about who follows after the Prophet Muhammad. They're divided about whether the Quran is eternally God's speech or created God's speech. But they all agree that the Quran is God's speech and that Muhammad is the prophet of God. Like that, the Shahada, and there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the prophet of God. We agree about this as Muslims. But you Christians, and they know this, right? Because in Eastern Christianity, you have both Chalcedonians and non-Chalcedonians as living churches, not as disappeared churches. Like, so the way that you're told the story, especially if you're a Protestant or a Catholic, is like Chalcedon, then all of the Nestorians and the Jacobites and the Monophysites, they kind of disappear. They didn't disappear. They're still Christians in Egypt and Iraq. And the Muslims writing know this, and they're essentially saying, look at you. If this is so logical, how can't you agree on your central claim of faith? We're not talking about a marginal thing. We're talking about the thing. And so I tweeted about this, and it caused a little bit of an uproar. A really good scholar who's a postdoc at Oxford, who's a Lebanese Christian, pushed back on me, rightfully so, on this, and it led to a little kerfuffle. And so, what I was trying to say and clarifying wasn't that, and this is how some of the Muslims took it, that the Trinity or the Incarnation are necessarily irrational and stupid. What I was trying to say is that if you're operating only in the assumptions of divine unity as given to you by Judaism and Islam on the one hand, and sort of Aristotelian logic on the other, the Trinity and the Incarnation, you're at a disadvantage. But that you can't make sense of, and here's my Protestantism and my Schleiermacherianism coming out, the Incarnation and the Trinity only makes sense in light of an already claim of God's presence for us in Jesus. And that is the more, we move from soteriology to theology. Because we experience God for us in Jesus, we then have to make claims about what this means. And so I don't think I think that Christians have come up with a way of making sense of this that doesn't mean it's irrational, but it does mean that it isn't a foundational, right? We have precognitive, well, not precognitive, we have a form of tradition that already has shaped the way we dialogue. And in this, I talk about this a little bit in the first chapter of my book. Actually, I'm influenced by David Burrell, who's a comparative theologian, a philosophical theologian. And one of the things he does is say, we don't have to get rid of these specificities, right? We don't have to get rid of the ways that Muslims claim that God speaks in Muhammad and Christians claim that God speaks as Jesus to understand each other. Actually, if you can follow the logic of Christian theology, it may actually help you follow the logic of Islamic theology and vice versa, and see the points where you diverge better and more clearly. And that there isn't this sort of neutral space of reason that we can all end up agreeing on, because whatever I mean by this, and I don't mean it in a like simplistic way, Christians have certain claims about Jesus that Muslims disagree with, and Muslims have certain claims about God's revelation in Muhammad that Christians disagree with. That doesn't mean we can't follow the logic of one another, but it helps us, and Dan Madigan points this out well, it helps us figure out where we actually agree and where we actually disagree. And it may be that we actually agree on things we thought we didn't, and disagree on things that we thought we agreed upon. And I think that's some of the joy and experience of doing theology in the comparative iteration, right? To take Muslims as seriously talking about the same God. I leave open-ended whether we worship the same God, because I think to predetermine that it is presumptuous, but that we're talking about the same God and that we're struggling for the truth and meaning of this God is part of the dialogue and the discovery. And for me, I'm the current book that I'm working on, and I talk about this a little bit in the last chapter, as well as some other things that I've published on. Theology is always a human endeavor. I mean, whether this is from Kathy Tanner or Lynn Tonstad or Schleiermacher, we aren't the judge and the jury over God. We're witnesses to God, and so are Muslims, and we're in a situation of testimony and counter testimony, of trying to make sense of this. And that's a little bit what I'm trying to get at in that thread and in my work more generally. It's off-putting to some people because here's my lingering Bardinism, like God is against religion, and I'm not in the business of defending religion, right? God's revelation is a critique of all religion, including mine. And I don't think Barth takes that seriously enough. And so I'm not entering into this to defend Christianity. I'm entering in this to bear witness to what I see or know, aware that I am a provisional human that could be wrong. And that isn't to minimize my faith. It's actually to say that my faith doesn't depend on me, but upon the one in whom I place my trust.
Thank you for that. That's really great. And I think one thing that comes out there, just that ties back to that conversation about like interfaith dialogue and action, is that we care about these things because we believe something, and something has generated a feeling and passion in us, and we should be honest about that, and then allow that to that hopefully will help shape and open up some more ways in which we can discuss and dialogue fruitfully, and open up more avenues into those kind of actions.
And the friendships, the meals, the social actions, those may create the space of trust that allow for those debates, right? So they could come first, and they could be totally necessary. But one of the things that I hope will happen is, bringing our whole self and all of its complications to the dialogue. If I already know, if I go into an interreligious dialogue with a Muslim and say, well, I already know our religions are the same, or our religions really are talking about the same thing. There's nothing to be learned. There's nothing to be discovered. And that's part of what I think the real excitement of this is that there's a possibility of being confronted and thinking afresh.
It's a great place to end. Thank you, Joshua, for coming on today. The book is Law and the Rule of God, out with Cambridge, and you can check it out, pick up a copy for yourself, for your grandma, for your local library, whoever you want to get it for. But it's a really excellent book, rich in detail, and it's really pushing on an argument that, as you say, is not the well-trodden territory of opening up another little degree. So other than the book, anything else you want to promote or draw people's attention to in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, if any of you have interest in learning a little bit more about Christian-Muslim relations, my colleagues and I have done a free 4-week short online course on Christian-Muslim relations through FutureLearn. I think it's still available to sign up for a couple more weeks. So we just sort of have some videos and readings that you
Great.
can walk through at your own pace. So if you're interested, we got 4 weeks on scripture, on theology, on politics, and on history.
Excellent. I'll put the link to that in the show notes below. Joshua Ralston, thank you for coming on Love, Rinse, Repeat. Thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you next week.